G'day, ladies and gentlemen. This podcast was interesting, talking to Jim Penman from Jim's group, Jim's Mowing, and an interesting conversation. We spent quite a bit of it talking about epigenetics and how one's ancestors almost dictates the people they become. Learned experiences from people thousands of years ago often show who we are or what we are capable of. And I haven't seen the science of it, or on it, rather. He is a big believer in this, and he's a big believer in that we could actually go in and change people's epigenetics and make them better at doing certain things, whether that is productivity or business or whatever. Now, whether or not that is the case, that's what he's spending. I think he said $3 million a year on research into doing that. And Jim has quite a bit of controversy around some of the things that he's said in the past. People accuse him of being really interested in things like eugenics. I brought that up with Jim, and he said, no, people are confused. They think they are correct because I use the word epigenetics and they're becoming confused with the words. Now, I don't know. I just don't know. It's very interesting what he's saying. And I went back and forth with myself because he did mention Indigenous people in the podcast. And I know that is a hot button topic in Australia right now. But I wasn't going to not let him on the podcast. I think it was interesting to hear someone's point of view. But I guess it remains to be seen whether or not there's any validity to what he's saying. I'm not sure. But it's interesting to hear people's opinions. Now, you may be a scientist in the comment section or something like that. I know most comment sections are filled with scientists, but you may actually have an idea of what you're talking about. Please let us know if he's onto it. We also spoke about how farmers, like maybe 100, 200, 300 years of someone being a farmer or their families being farmers, maybe their epigenetics won't allow them to become successful in big cities. So it is an interesting one, but I thought I'd just jump on early in this to say, like, we don't know. This scientific field, whether or not it's been debunked, I'm not quite sure. But yeah, it was interesting what he had to say. I don't know if he's correct. I'd like to know, maybe you know. So let me know in the comment section down below your thoughts on this podcast and what you think about what Jim has to say on epigenetics. It's a field that I know bugger all about.
Ladies and gentlemen, Jim Penman from Jim's group. How you doing, mate?
Yeah, good. Yeah, fitting well.
Everybody knows the face on that logo of Jim's Mowing or Jim's anything, really, but that is you.
Yeah, that is me. If you actually Google Jim Penman images, there's a picture of me with a beard and a hat against an old trailer. That's taken from that actual photo.
How long ago was that logo designed?
Well, it wasn't much of a design. All I did was, when I started out, before I started as a franchise, I used to put my photo on leaflets because it got a better response that way. And then when we franchised, I said, just a graphic artist will just, do a design of me, of the photo. And it was just a line drawing of that. And then we put the name Jim. The hardest thing was working out what lettering to use. We actually tried a few and stuck them around the office. So that's how it began. And then we changed the logo a few years later because the original one was a bit solemn. So we made it a bit more.
Imagine it is difficult to change logos and whatnot. And I know a lot of money from certainly large businesses goes into designing logos, but it's like picking a child's name, isn't it? It's in my experience, at the very least, picking a brand name is very, very difficult. But obviously yours not as difficult.
I would think the total amount of work with me was probably a half an hour, mostly trying to work out the best font. So it was really not much of an effort at all.
To me through, I want to talk across a whole range of things, but where did Jim's group come from? Where did that sort of originate?
Well, I intended to be an academic. I wanted to. I did a PhD in history back in the 70s, and with the idea that rethinking the world of history, of society, of how it works and so forth. And I used to do lawn mowing as a sideline because it was kind of good exercise and paid pretty well, and even managed to buy a small house when I was a student. So it was good as a sideline. And then I ended up, the end of my academic career went nowhere. There was no possible way I was going to get a job. So I just started mowing lawns full time. But the aim of it was the implications of the research I did, even though they were in history, were all in biology. And I wanted to run a research institute, but I had no money. So I sort of had to become rich in some ways. That was kind of the idea behind it. That was the drive. And I currently do have this research. It's spending about $3 million a year, but I'm just about to go and meet my research head for lunch.
Interested in, because you are working in the field of epigenetics and
Yes.
basically what travels through. Would you say this is correct? Travels through genes of people, or is expressed through genes, and how a person, or what a person becomes later in their life, is often decided generations before. Is that a fair way of
Yes.
looking at epigenetics?
It's decided by your parents and your grandparents, because epigenetics inherited, but also by your own life experience too. So all that affects. See, a gene basically is a way of pumping out a protein. I mean, that's the simple way to look at it. And these little genes have taps on them. You can have things like a tap that turns it off, like a methyl group, or turns it down. You can open it up. So it's basically stuff that attaches on the genes to work out how they work. And that's what basically makes the difference between a society which is wealthy or a society that is poor, or one that's aggressive or passive, those kind of things. All to do with character, to do with creativity. They're all to do with the way genes are turned on or off.
Say a society that is poor, let's look at sub-Saharan Africa perhaps. Would you say that is more to do with genes than outside interactions with people?
Well, it's not to do with genes as such, because the genetically similar sub-Saharan Africans and us are the same. Essentially, we're extremely similar species. There's more variation in chimpanzees and a few hectares of Congolese rainforest than there is in the entire human race. Genetically, we're very, very similar. The difference is in what happens to the genes, whether they're turned on or off. And that's got to do with history and with culture and all kinds of things. But until you change the genetics, until you change the epigenetics, I should say, you can't do away with the fundamental differences and inequalities.
Let's say there's a family who have been downtrodden for 500 years. You know, the likelihood of child A coming out of that family in 2023 and going on to be a successful entrepreneur or something like that is unlikely, bearing on their, or just because, well, not just because, but one of the mitigating factors may be that they just don't have the skills built into their genome to go out and try and chase these dreams that some people may have. Perhaps it's more to do with survival, and you know, because they have been so downtrodden throughout history, that the likelihood of them succeeding is very low.
Yes, well, yeah, they've got different characters, another way of looking at it. There's a economic historian, Gregory Clark, that pointed out that the character of people in Britain changed dramatically over the years going up to the Industrial Revolution. They became quite different. They were more, the gap between skilled and unskilled labor in terms of wages went down. People were a lot more interested in gaining skills. They were more interested in becoming educated. They became different psychologically, temperamentally. There was an epigenetic change that took place. And people in sub-Saharan Africa, it's not so much the fact they've been downtrodden. They're in a society which has different kinds of requirements. Or choose another example, Aboriginals as an example. Now, Aboriginals are perfectly adapted by their epigenetics is perfectly adapted to a hunter-gatherer society. They're very good at it. They'd be far better off than we would in that kind of society, because they're very good on close family bonds, those kind of things. It's just that the epigenetics that suits a hunter-gatherer society doesn't work quite as well in an industrial society. Genetically speaking, they're very similar, but the epigenetics is different, and it's evolved for a different purpose.
But you could understand where, when you say something like Indigenous people are genetically predisposed for not being able to deal with certain situations.
Epigenetically.
Genetically
almost identical. Really, really, really similar. Don't be fooled by
predisposed.
Color of skin and so forth. Is the epigenetics that matter. That's the difference, you see. When I put my books out, I got some really hostile press from racists. They didn't like it because they liked the idea that some races are better than others. And I said, no, they're not better. They're exactly genetically the same. It's the epigenetics, and epigenetics is profoundly changeable. So the idea is that the white man is genetically superior. People used to think 150 years ago. It's just ridiculous. Not at all. We're the same, but the epigenetics is different. If you can change the epigenetics, then everything else changes.
Exactly the same, apart from maybe some, melanin content, that type of stuff.
Trivial. How much has the color of your skin got to do with your ability to do anything? It doesn't.
But epigenetically speaking, we have become the people we are based on thousands of generations before us.
Yes. Yeah. Epigenetics is carried forward. Epigenetics changes is driven by a number of different things. Lifestyle can change it. For example, if you're in a society where farming is the only way to live, there's a very strong epigenetic tendency to become more of that kind of person who's good at farming. And even the very fact of working, like if you work, for example, rather than say idle it around, you'll tend to move epigenetically towards a hardworking temperament. People know that, but there's epigenetics in that. Now, what actually happened, say back 10,000 years ago when farming started in the Middle East, it was at first very gradual. It took a long time for people to learn how to do this. And what was interesting actually is when agriculture spread across Europe, as an example, it wasn't actually so much the initial people taking up agriculture. It was migrants from the Middle East moving in who were good at farming already, and they mixed with the local people, but they basically, genetically speaking, they outbred them because there were far more of them. So it's very difficult to change the epigenetics. It takes a long time. And one of the ways that the societies work is we have cultural technologies which drive epigenetic change, and we call these things religions. So Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, not exactly religion. They're all cultural technologies which have the effect of making epigenetic changes over multiple generations. For example, there are practices like chastity. If you restrict sexual activity, especially in adolescence and in early adulthood, you'll have a distinct epigenetic change. And we've seen this in rats. If you expose rats to females when they're just about age of puberty, they're quite different from those that haven't had that experience. So chastity is one. Fasting is another. The Ramadan fast of Islam, for example, where they don't eat during daylight for a whole month, which is really, they don't even drink. It's very tough. That has an epigenetic effect on the individual, and that affects their character, but it also affects the next generation. So that's how civilizations basically work. You get changes in lifestyle, which has a demand for different kinds of character, and then you get these cultural technologies, these religions, who actually change epigenetics into a form that will help people to succeed in that kind of environment.
The teachings of our ancestors, like, be afraid of the dark, and should worry about what's under your bed and things like that, the children seem to have. Is that the same sort of vein?
Oh, I think fear of the dark and of spiders and snakes is pretty much hardwired in. But I'm not talking about things that control sexual behavior and family behavior. Like, for example, you don't commit adultery. Thou shalt not commit adultery is a perfect example of a cultural technology that actually has an effect on character.
And what point does religion become just teachings of how to behave, as opposed to an ingrained genetic feeling, like an epigenetic feeling of, you're afraid of the dark, but you shouldn't sleep with your mate's husband because it's the wrong thing to do? Is one just like a created technology, created by man for man, and the other is just hardwired?
Well, that's a difficult. I'm a Christian, so I would tend to say that God is behind all this kind of stuff. But the fact of the matter is the rules contained in religion simply have this kind of effect. Now, whether they were divinely inspired at some stage or whether they just evolved by nature, because there is a sort of, okay, if you have different kinds of culture, different kinds of religions competing with each other, a religious system that helps people to become more successful is going to be help. The people who have that are going to have more kids, and they're going to be more dominant. They're going to have better lives and so forth. A good example is Judaism. Now, Judaism has a system of law, which is a really intricate one that controls a whole lot of things, not just chastity and things like fasting, but also, the way you work and the days of the week, Sabbath keeping and so forth. There's a whole mass of different regulations controlling life. That actually has a profound epigenetic effect, especially over generations, in creating a kind of character which is very, very good at business. And that's what Judaism is. It's a cultural technology that drives people to be good at business. And even sort of elements like the fact that the prestige of studying the Torah, which is a huge thing in traditional Judaism. It's part of that whole thing, because if you study and study and study and study the Torah, you're actually creating an epigenetic change in yourself, which makes you more likely your children will be good at business, for example.
It's measurable. Like, how can you, at what point can you say this is because of your epigenetics? Is this a code that's written into the genome? How does one observe it?
Well, actually, you can study it. You can do tests. So, for example, one of the things we're doing with rats is we're studying effects of two things: mild food restriction, which is equivalent to the similar effect of things like chastity and so forth, and also what we call eustress, moderate stress, which actually sort of toughens the individual, makes them more confident, more aggressive, for example. What you can actually do is you can get samples, and you can do what's called a methylome. You can actually go in and you can test which genes are turned on or off, to what extent. So, for example, we know that when you restrict food for rats, certain kinds of genes are turned on or off, and that also depends on what section of the brain. So, for example, the effect on the amygdala can be different from the effect on the hippocampus. So the epigenetic changes aren't the same across all parts of the body. So exactly the kind of influence causes a different epigenetic change in different parts of the brain and different parts of the body. It's complicated enough.
It is very complicated.
You can measure it. You can actually do. You can actually study the whole epigenome, like you can study the genome. You can study the epigenome too, and you can work out exactly what genes are turned on or off.
Such a complex discussion, and one needs to have a PhD in it to sort of, or in that field, to understand it. And it sounds like you have studied it to the point where you have the equivalent.
Well, actually, no. I'm afraid I don't, Isaac. I'm actually a mere historian. I speak the words and understand it, but the people in my research team know far more than I do. That's for sure. I've got my head of my research has been working in this field for decades, mostly in terms of cancer and things like that. So he understands it far better than I do.
The layman, you would have a much better understanding of it. But I think one of the issues when you speak about it that you will come across is people, when they hear, like what you said before about if we can sort of get an injection into people to help them come out of this, that is a big pill for people to swallow, because they see it as you saying that this group of people is the same league as another group, and that's a lot for people to really take on board, particularly now in a society where we only read a headline. If it comes up with a headline, Jim Penman says this, then all of a sudden people take that and they only create a view on you and what you're saying by that headline. And when I look up your name, eugenics is something that comes up a lot.
Yes,
as I'm sure
you know why eugenics comes up, Isaac. It's because people don't understand the difference between eugenics and epigenetics. They sound similar, but they're totally different. Eugenics is genetic selection. It's assuming that certain kinds of people are superior to others, and you select and you breed the genes. Epigenetics is different. Epigenetics says the genetic difference is not important. What's the matter is how the genes are turned on or off. So it's, in a way, it's the opposite. See, racists love eugenics. They don't like epigenetics because it undercuts their whole point that some people, mostly the racists themselves, are superior to others. Right? I don't accept that at all. So there is this confusion because people don't understand what the words mean. But no, I don't believe in eugenics at all. I think that's actually people grossly exaggerate how important genetics is. It's far, far, far less important than people think. And epigenetics is far, far more important. So one thing I wouldn't do to try and improve society is any kind of eugenic change. But the point about the thing is, I'm not suggesting that people go out and start mass inoculating Aboriginals or whatever. That'd be crazy. What I'm saying is, if we could develop a treatment, the most immediate application would be in terms of things like addiction. It should be, you've got somebody who's a drug addict, who's in a hopeless spiral, who's losing health, whose life expectancy is low, who's homeless, who's got all sorts of problems. And there's a solution, which is an injection, let's say. If it is, it could be something different. Who knows? It could be a pheromone, it could be anything, which can actually help that person to live a happy, productive, useful life. And they can get out of their spiral and they can just improve and go. Now, if that was shown to work, wouldn't people in that situation say, yes, I don't want to be a hopeless drug addict or alcoholic. I want to live a happy, good life. And they take this and it works for them. Now, what will also happen, though, too, is that this stuff will tend to be used off-label. Because what will happen is that people like you and me were to get access to it, we will become that much more hardworking and productive that would give us a fantastic boost. So, for example, if you've got students in a course, say, and they start taking this treatment, maybe off-label, and they become hardworking and productive, and they soar at the top of the class, and they become doctors, and they become accountants, and they become entrepreneurs. People are going to look at this and say, what are you doing? Well, I'm using this stuff. I want some of that. That's almost certainly what would happen. You're not going to go out to a group of people and say, you should take this. You're going to start people saying, I want this because I want to be like that. And frankly, I would be first in the queue if this is ever available, because I know quite well I could be a lot more hardworking and a lot more productive if I had this.
Sounds like how students use Adderall. They know that they can use it for benefits, and it is. I'm not sure in Australia how widespread it is, but particularly in the US, that's as common as Tic Tacs when it comes to students. They love it.
It is too. And they use it because it gives them concentration, even though it has some terrible side effects. Imagine if you had a treatment that was available to you as a student that was far more effective in terms of making you successful, but had no bad effects at all. The only side effects you might not like, it'd probably drop your libido to some extent. Well, it should. That's the way it would work. But you become more focused, more long-term thinking, more disciplined, more hardworking, just more effective. And people want to succeed. People want to do well. So that's a powerful thing. If we could develop a treatment that would work for this, it would take off like crazy. It's like these drugs that they developed for diabetes, which are now used off-label because they've been found to have significant effects on weight loss.
Wegovy, Ozempic. There's a few different ones that people are using quite a bit.
But this would also these treatments that I'm developing would actually help weight loss because it'd make people more disciplined. So they'd be much easier to avoid the fatty food and the sugar and stuff, and then get exercise. The discipline, long-term thinking is all part of what it's about. So it would be a dynamite treatment if we could develop it. You wouldn't have to persuade anybody to take it. They'd be knocking the doors down to get hold of it. And once that happens, the whole world's going to change, because you're going to get people like Aboriginals doing it too, and suddenly they're going to become incredibly successful as well. And then anybody else is going to say, "Wow, I want to be part of that." They might not want to. It's up to them, because there will be changes in character. So you might become a bit less social in a general sense. But generally speaking, in terms of success in industrial society, this stuff would be absolute gold.
Because you have to be careful. You're talking about people who are out in regional areas, or you're talking about all Aboriginal people?
Anybody, of course. It doesn't matter where they are. But people in regional areas might not want to take it. This is the thing you've got to remember. There are going to be changes in character that you might not like. So, for example, if you've got an Aboriginal who was in an outback settlement to become temperamentally a lot more like a medical student or something like that, very hardworking, disciplined stuff, they wouldn't be as social.
And I'm fascinated. I'm fascinated by the success of gyms, because it has just grown. It's synonymous throughout Australia with gyms Mowing, but there are many other ventures throughout the entire group. 5,000 franchisees. Where did the franchisee idea come from, and why do you think it's been so successful?
Well, I was mowing lawns. I had subcontractors. I was puddling along. I used to build up and sell lawn mowing rounds. That was what I did in the 80s to a large extent. And then a competitor came, which was franchising, which is VIP, and they came from Adelaide, and they just terrified me. I thought these guys would crush me. They had 250 franchisees. So I basically franchised in self-defense. I thought if they don't do something, then these guys will just eat me alive. And somebody asked me at the beginning how many franchisees I might have one day, and I said, maybe if it works well, maybe 100. I was just surprised. But the key idea I had, which was the right idea, and I made a lot of really, really, really dumb mistakes, including some in the last 6 months, I can tell you. But I did have one concept. I wanted a system that would be really attractive to franchisees. So I put in places all kinds of weird stuff, like the fact that people could pay the same base fee and they could earn whatever they like. You're going to earn millions of dollars in gyms. You pay the same base fee. You have absolute right to territory. Jobs coming to territory you get. Otherwise, you're not limited. You can work wherever you like. You can vote out your own franchisor. You can move to a different region, different franchisor if you want to. You can veto changes to your own manual. There's a whole stack of things I put in to say what would I want to do if I was a potential franchisee? So I made it as attractive as I possibly could. And then we just kept on looking at ways to make franchisees happier, what kind of training, what kind of support, how often should we have meetings? We just looked at everything that said, what's your aim? How can I make my franchisees delighted? And surprisingly successful.
I remember when we first started, I was talking to Joel from Jim's Group, real good guy. And he was talking about one of the things that you guys wanted to do was really push the idea that for young people or, people in their 20s, like university has been seen for the last 20, 30 years as a prerequisite to life,
yes,
to moving into the adult world. And I've been very distant on that idea for a long time. I had no idea what I wanted to do at 18 years old. And I absolutely did not want to get deep into debt. That's what I was pretty confident I didn't want to do that. And yet we see so many young people dive straight into university. They're terrified of going out into the real world without a piece of paper saying what they do. But I think that if I had done that, I wouldn't be in the position I am in now. I wouldn't value hard work. I would have half-assed it through the entire things, the whole P's get degrees mentality. And I would probably be a teacher. That's what I would have done, because that's the only thing I could get into, which is horrifying to consider that someone who didn't do overly well at school, the only thing he could get into was teaching other children how to be good at school. It is quite strange.
Yeah, look, you're quite right about that too. There's an over-emphasis on tertiary education. I mean, just take a guy like Dan Carl, who's one of my franchisors. He was actually a high school dropout, dropped out in year 10, went to work for McDonald's places, bought a lawn mowing franchise with great trepidation, but was quite successful. At his peak, turned over close to $1 million a year. He's now become one of our major franchisors. This guy's a multi-millionaire. He's in his 20s, okay? A high school dropout, never been to university in his life. That's the possibility if you've got the right character. And again, it's come back to what we talked about before. It's all to do with character. If you've got a great character, doesn't matter where you start off. You can start off mowing lawns. You can start off delivering pizza. It doesn't matter. You'll see the opportunity and you'll go for them. And I think education basically gets you in an interview. If you've got an employer gets a whole kinds of applicants, they'll just say, oh, well, how do I choose? Okay, if you've been to university, if you've got a degree, you've got a master's, whatever, then you've at least shown ability to work for a few years consistently. I'll scrub anybody else and I'll just interview you lot. That's what it works for. It doesn't actually teach you anything very much. It's just a way of helping employers select a candidate. And then when they get the job, they learn how to do the job. Let's face it, a lawyer who comes out of law school knows nothing. That's why most 3/4 of them can't get law jobs, because there's no demand for them. Once they've worked for a couple of years, they know how to be a lawyer, then they're employable.
That must be to leave university and then struggle to get a job for 1, 2, 3 years.
And loaded up with this vast student debt. Yeah, I would think people ought to consider working with their hands to a large extent. There's a lot more opportunity, especially for guys who aren't necessarily so good at education, in doing something manual. You can make a lot of money. Carpenters these days are getting paid $60, $70, $80 an hour. Carpenters, for heaven's sake. There's not many white collar workers making that kind of money. And if you're a carpenter, you can have your own business. You can become a builder. You become a developer. You can buy properties. You can develop. You can do all kinds of things. There's a wonderful book called The Millionaire Next Door, which is about American millionaires. And they're actually typically people who are like me, and they are like your tech gurus and so forth. The people who have gone into the basic trade type areas and become successful and employ people. That's how it's done. And it's all to do with character.
Very much for your time, mate. I appreciate that. We've all got places to go and people to see this morning. So thank you for giving up your time. And is there anything you'd like to add for people listening to this who are interested in perhaps following a career with gyms?
Just www.gyms.net. And if you're interested in biohistory, www.biohistory.org. Have a look at that. There's some videos in to explain the whole thing.
I think there's a long conversation to be had on this. So thank you very much for your time, mate. And I think to really get to the crux of it, we'd need 3 or 4 hours. But thank you for your time. I do appreciate that.
Good.